John Blair isn't the only one who thinks our failure to effectively address the challenges we face reflects a lack of political will. A number of groups and organizations are trying to do something about that, including one that brings people of different faiths together to lobby the Kansas legislature.
The organization initially started off as a single-issue climate change organization called Kansas Interfaith Power and Light. It's part of a national network of organizations. In 2016, we became Kansas Interfaith Action, with climate being one of our issue areas.
Rabbi Modi Reber serves as the executive director of Kansas Interfaith Action, also referred to as KIFA.
So we're a statewide organization that works on issue advocacy on the state level. So I am a registered lobbyist. We have affiliations with most of the major denominations in the state, most of the major mainline denominations in the state. So we bring the faith voice to conversations about public policy in areas like Medicaid expansion, poverty issues, hunger issues, clean energy. So anything that comes up that's in those issue areas we'll get involved with. That could mean meeting with legislators, testifying, doing action alerts, doing demonstrations sometimes, depending on the situation, but always trying to get our voice heard so that people realize that there's a strong faith voice for justice. We say climate is a justice issue, primarily because the people who are hurt first and worst by climate disruption are poor people and people of color. And that's both in this country and abroad. But the people who have the least capacity for dealing with the problem and who have the least responsibility for causing the problem often get the worst repercussions of it, and they also have the least resources for dealing with the problem.
When addressing the diverse problems confronting the world today, the rabbi references a concept that's become more widely used in recent years.
Tikkun olam is the Jewish concept of repairing the world. That we, as human beings, have a unique responsibility to helping put God's will into work in the world. That the world is broken in important ways, including the way we power our society, and pollution and climate disruption. And one of the ways we do godly work is by addressing those issues, both healing the damage, but also making sure that people don't suffer due to the damage.
We've been talking about the danger of the Keystone Pipeline since 2011, 2012.
That's right.
And there's been, I think it's 20 spans.
During one of its advocacy days at the state capitol, KIFA put the spotlight on a major rupture involving a pipeline passing through the state, which took place in December of 2022. Originating in Canada, the pipeline carries a diluted form of a substance called bitumen, an oil product derived from tar sands.
We were on record as opposing the Keystone Pipeline for a long time, and we were part of the coalition that led first Obama and then Biden to cancel the XL pipeline. But there's still a Keystone Pipeline that comes through central Kansas, and it burst, releasing hundreds of thousands of gallons of this bitumen in farmland in north central Kansas. It happened in a place where there's not a lot of press. People were kept out of the site, so they couldn't really see the site. They claim that everything's been cleaned up, but I know that they were very interested in keeping things kind of quiet. It speaks to a larger issue. The more we rely on extreme forms of energy, using these tar sands, piping these tar sands across the country, the more dangerous it is. The more likely it is that it's going to have a severe environmental cost.
So we are here today to call attention to this violence that's been done on the earth. And we've brought together activists and faith leaders to talk about this issue. The first thing
The thing about the Kansas legislature is that there's no place to have a conversation about environmental issues or climate issues. There's commodity committees like ag and natural resources, there's energy, but there isn't an environment committee. So every time something comes up that has an environmental, it usually goes through one of the commerce committees or the utilities committee, and they might not be thinking in terms that we would want them to think. We're past the point of having hearings about climate change. Like, we used to have hearings about whether climate change was real or not, where there'd be a dog and pony show. They don't do that so much anymore. That conversation is different. And so instead of actually addressing the dangers, try to pretend they don't exist. And you still don't hear the word climate in the legislature at all, really. It's a difficult time.
Not a single bill
We have a
had been signed
fairly
into law.
supportive governor.
People had just dug in their
She certainly
heels
knows a
to
lot about
refuse
clean
to
energy and
budge.
supportive of clean energy. In Kansas, we've done very well with the wind industry. We're one of the biggest producers of wind energy in the country. And that's largely due to policies that were put in place years ago that have led to that result.
Wind seemed to be a very natural fit for Kansans.
Before she became Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Obama administration, Kathleen Sebelius served as Kansas Insurance Commissioner prior to being elected governor in 2002 and re-elected in 2006. She says she knew very little about energy issues when she began her tenure as governor.
So it wasn't really until I got to the governor's office, and I would say kind of came in a bit the back door, where I think the first projects that really involved alternative energy from the start was trying to save the tall grass prairie, the park that Nancy Kassebaum and Dan Glickman had brought into the federal system as partners. And the foundation had always been a little shaky because there wasn't a funding stream, and we were very worried that some of the folks who had the land were actually going to split it up and develop it, and saving that piece of prairie became a project that I began to learn about wind energy and natural preservation and the concerns that local ranchers and farmers had about land preservation, but also they didn't really want wind farms located up and down their prairie views. So that led to then discussions with a lot of the utility companies about what the wind potential was in Kansas, where we could locate. Those discussions began.
As governor, she instituted a moratorium on the construction of wind farms in the Flint Hills.
We put this kind of voluntary agreement on top of leases that in many cases had already been signed. The wind energy companies were well ahead of us and had gone and signed up farmers and ranchers all throughout this area, and there could have been a proliferation of wind farms. What was very clear, though, is we had some deep pockets who were some of the, I would say, leisure ranchers, farmers, who made it clear they were willing to use their resources and tie these projects up for decades in court. And so if indeed the boundaries that were drawn were not honored by the energy companies, they would never have a wind farm anywhere in Kansas.
At about the same time that wind energy was beginning to take off in Kansas, an electric utility in southwestern Kansas unveiled plans to add another unit or two to its coal-fired power plant near the small town of Holcomb, west of Garden City.
And we didn't need any of the energy that was being promoted as a part of the Holcomb plant. We had plenty of resources in Kansas that Holcomb was going to be built to ship all of the energy to other states, principally Colorado, but we would have the carbon in our air. So it, in that way, it seemed like a really bad trade to me.
In order to proceed with its plans, the utility needed to obtain a permit from the state agency charged with protecting public health and the environment. When the permit was denied, the Kansas legislature attempted to override the decision, but Governor Sebelius exercised her veto power.
So there wasn't, I don't even think, a sense that in Kansas we would begin this battle. The battle was engaged, I think, after the permit was requested and education began. There was a group called PACE, and it was a broad-based activist coalition who did a pretty amazing job beginning to educate Kansans about what this fight was about.
GPACE came into existence because thousands of Kansans deserve better. They've told us that, we believe that, and we're here to fight for our place at the table to help lend a voice for a clean, renewable energy economy for the state of Kansas.
People didn't know a lot. As I say, climate change was not a familiar terminology. Even the notion that air pollution directly affected your health wasn't familiar, but a lot of education was done about those connections. If you have another coal plant in Kansas, it will mean that your grandchildren could get sick, that they may have asthma and not be able to thrive as well as they would with cleaner air. If we do this, this portion of the population will it made very direct connections between what was going on with air quality and what was happening with the health of the people, and then made a corollary argument that we have this possibility of dirtier air and more unclean air and more carbon in the air, or this amazing natural resource, which is available, which could benefit some of the same communities and constituencies, which will bring economic development. We could be a leader, and it's an asset that doesn't harm anybody and actually could add to the benefit of the state. So they had the opportunity to both do education on the dangers of the carbon issue, but also the real merits of pursuing a clean energy initiative.
Plans to build another coal-fired unit at the Holcomb plant were eventually dropped as more and more wind turbines were erected across the region. Arrays of solar panels constructed by electric companies have also added to the mix of renewable energy in Kansas. But there are still concerns about where these installations are situated, which Brian Obermeyer of the Nature Conservancy has been dealing with.
I've been real involved in siting of renewables since about 2002, and it was just a couple months after I saw my first industrial, commercial wind farm that realized that the Flint Hills were being considered for a lot of wind development. There were multiple projects being looked at. So I wrestled with that some, and I remember talking to the former president of the Nature Conservancy and asked him, how should we address this? And he said, a threat is a threat and should be treated as such, but treat it as a siting issue, not whether or not we should have renewables, but make this a siting issue. And we really did. We focused on that, and I think we've had a real positive influence in how we've been able to help steer renewables. More recently, there's a lot of interest in solar, and I think we're going to see a lot of commercial scale solar development, which is really cool, but there's really good places to do it and other places where it'd be less desirable. What's resulted from that first effort, that first wind farm I saw, and lots of different folks from across the Conservancy working on this issue, was the creation of something that's now called Site Renewables Right. It's a mapping process where you can identify, where key wildlife, key landscapes are at, as well as places that are in proximity to transmission lines that are feasible for that development, and providing the purchasers of renewable energy, developers of renewable energy, that resource. Our focus is obviously in those key wildlife areas that we think will be impacted by that development. But what's really cool is just within, we originally focused in Kansas and then Oklahoma and part of Texas, so part of a 3-state area. And then we expanded out to 17 states and most recently 19 states. But within, the 17 states of the Great Plains, which is where a lot of the particularly wind resources are at in the country, we identified over 1 terawatts, which is 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity that could be developed in that area, which is a huge number. It's basically the equivalent of the energy being produced over the whole country right now with multiple sources. The key message here is that there is an opportunity to do renewable energy right, and by identifying areas where there's going to be less conflict, it could actually accelerate the development of renewable energy. So our goal is not to be a roadblock to the development of renewable energy. We want to see more renewable energy developed, but we want to see it done in a responsible way. And so by identifying those areas of less conflict, there's going to be less roadblocks. There's going to be fewer projects that get stalled and canceled as a result of siting issues. And so I think we can, I think it's really a positive thing for renewable energy to provide that roadmap to do it in a way that has less conflict.